You mentioned the sectarian violence in Pakistan. This is a country whose raison d'etre is Islam. It was formed as a haven and a homeland for South Asian Muslims. Nevertheless, and this is long before the Taliban, long before the Afghan war, the country has been plagued by attacks on Shias, who are a religious Muslim minority in Pakistan. What is the root of that?
Well, it's actually, to go back to your comment that Pakistan was formed as a homeland for South Asian Muslims is not strictly 100% true. Because if you read Aisha Jalal, the historian Aisha Jalal, her book, which I'm sure you've done, The Sole Spokesman, and if you hear her recent interview on Radio Open Source in which she talks about it, she basically, Pakistan, the founder of the country, who himself incidentally was a Shia, Jinnah himself was a Shia, it was not that all Indian Muslims should come to live in Pakistan. I mean, it would be unsustainable. It's impossible. You know, there are more Muslims in India than there are in Pakistan. You know, which people forget. Not for long, though, I'm sure the way that the population in Pakistan is rising. But the point is that it was Jinnah had argued for a federation in which Muslims would get disproportionate representation in states where they were not in a majority. And Nehru and the Congress refused to accept that because they wanted a strong center. And the cost of that strong center was partition, which Jinnah did not want, and he said he did not want, quote unquote, this moth-eaten and truncated Pakistan where Punjab was divided and Bengal was divided. And however, that is how things played out. And the first thing he said was that, you know, this is not going to be a religious state. It is going to be a country where you are free to go to your mosque, you are free to go to your temples. Muslims will cease to be Muslims and Hindus will cease to be Hindus, not in the religious sense, but in the sense that all are citizens of the same state. So to say that it was meant to be an Islamic country is not strictly true, because although that's how it seems like it, but if you look at it a little bit more in depth, then you do see that, you know, the idea was not to have a country where it would be a homogeneous Muslim population, and Pakistan had at that time about a 10% non-Muslim population, and there's still a sizable number of Hindus, Christians, Parsis, Sikhs in Pakistan, you know, in the millions, you know. So it's not, and people whom these so-called religious extremists consider to be non-Muslims, the Shiites. It's like 13% of Pakistan's population is Shia, you know. This religious frenzy, these wall chalkings, I mean, during the Zia years and soon after the Zia years, you had wall chalkings denouncing Shia as kafirs, as non-Muslims. So, you know, then there's no end to it if you just stick to religion. And it's one of Mr. Jinnah's first acts was to form a commission for the protection of non-Muslims or for religious minorities, and he himself was the head of that commission. Unfortunately, he died, within a year, just barely a year after the country was made. And then after that, the people who we didn't have a constitution until 56, and then that constitution was abrogated, and the next constitution we had was in 1973, which has been thoroughly mutilated. I mean, if you look at the pattern in Pakistan, the 10-year, like the 47 to say 58 was complete chaos after Jinnah's death particularly, and then you had Ayub Khan, the military dictator, for 10 years or more. Then you had the civil war with East Pakistan and the partition of and Bangladesh's independence. Then you had General Ziaul Haq come in shortly after that, within just a few years. Then you had 10 years of what I call musical chairs democracy, where no government stayed for more than a year and a half or 2 years because they were toppled every time. And then you had Musharraf come in for another 10 years. I mean, so what is 60 years in the long scheme of things? It's nothing. It's a drop in the ocean. It's like, very small amount of time. So if this political process continues, and one of the things this government has done, what President Zardari has done, is that he has signed away the powers of the president to dissolve assembly. which Ziaul Haq had introduced, which is one of the reasons why democracy has not been able to take root in Pakistan. So a lot of things have been happening. A lot of steps by Parliament have been taken over the last few years, couple of years. For example, the National Finance Commission. I'm sorry, scrap that. They've passed amendments that give more autonomy to the provinces. They've passed laws for education, against sexual harassment, for gender rights. A lot of things, but all of these things will take a long time to take effect. I mean, no changes will be visible overnight. It takes years. It's a process.
I'll talk about a couple of internal matters again in Pakistan. One is the power and influence of the military, sometimes called the state within a non-state. Aisha Siddiqa has written a book called Military Inc., which documents the enormous economic power that the Pakistani military exerts, much like its counterparts in Iran and Egypt, I might say. So that's one question about the Pakistani military. And the other question is, much is made of the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence. Who does it answer to? Is it part and parcel of the military?
Well, see, until this government came in February 28 after elections, pretty much the military establishment and the political establishment were one, because the military was dominating the scene and formulating foreign policy as well as domestic policy, as well as economic policy, actually. So now you have with this government an attempt to assert civilian power, and that is something the military is not happy over, and it is not used to taking orders from the civilian government. And if the civilian government says we want a no first use nuclear policy, the military establishment is not happy with that. And you recall that in 2008, it was President Zardari who actually said that Pakistan would pursue a no first use nuclear policy. But the way he did it, he said it in a conclave, the Hindustan Times, via video. And 4 days after that, you had the attacks on Mumbai. So I don't know if that's a coincidence. Is somebody trying to teach him a lesson? I don't know. But the point is that to say that the ISI and the military are a state within a non-state well, it's kind of unkind, but that's not what we want. We want them to be under the civilian government, to take their orders from civilian government. The government, constitutionally, they come under the government. The ISI constitutionally is answerable to this elected civilian government. But because we haven't had elected civilian governments all these years, they're answerable to no one but themselves, and they've sort of become this amorphous monster that nobody knows where the head or tail of it is, and who it answers to, what's the chain of command. And there are petitions in the Supreme Court asking exactly those kind of questions, but the Supreme Court isn't taking them up in a hurry. You have it is the government that is responsible for appointing the Chief of Army Staff and extensions and all of that. But it will take some time for that equation to sort itself out, if it is allowed to. And for that to happen, I'll just repeat myself to say that the political process, the democratic electoral political process, has to continue uninterrupted. General
Pervez Musharraf, when he was ruling Pakistan from 1999 until 2007, 2008, he dismissed the Chief Justice at the time, Iftikhar Chaudhry, and a fairly spontaneous lawyers' movement arose. I witnessed it in Karachi and Islamabad and Lahore, and it was very impressive to see these guys with suits, demonstrating for judicial and political freedom. Now, Musharraf then steps down. Iftikhar Chaudhry is reinstated as Chief Justice, and that lawyers' movement has disappeared. Why didn't it sustain itself? Why did it go back into why did the lawyers go back into their offices and not continue the political work that needs to be done?
Well, lawyers are lawyers and they need to do their legal work. Just as judges are judges and they need to do their legal work. We have a huge backlog of cases in the courts in Pakistan, and I think everybody needs to do what they should be doing. It's not the job of lawyers to take out political demonstrations. They did that for a while under a certain need, the Black Coat movement as it was called. But once that objective was achieved, there's no point in them being out in the streets for what? The judiciary, Pervez Musharraf was not within his constitutional rights to quote-unquote sack the Chief Justice, and he paid for it. And that was actually the first time that we had a military dictator in Pakistan leave office, and there was no, with no violence or bloodshed or anything. So I think we made progress. I mean, look at the situation over the last few years in Pakistan, particularly over the last few months in Pakistan. I think by now, 10 years ago, if this had happened, the government would have gone. And some people say maybe it should have gone, and then let there be fresh elections and all that. But then again, you're going into the same cycle of early elections and not letting them complete their term and all of that. So, does that answer your question?
Well, I would just respond to that this is a very privileged group in society that has a lot of leverage and could be very influential politically if they sustain the movement.
Yeah, but that's not what their job is. Their job is to defend people in the courts and to bring cases to a closure. Their job is not to garland murderers, which some of them have been doing. When you become political and you become politicized, then which politics do you take? You could go right or left, and we've seen groups of lawyers, glorify and garland the murder of Governor Salman Taseer only because that murder was committed in the name of religion. Quite wrongly, it was committed. It was a cowardly act of murder, and the murderer is in prison. But it was groups of lawyers that were garlanding him, and it's a former Supreme Court judge who's taking up his case pro bono. I mean, take up pro bono cases of people who are poor and who are innocent. Why are you taking up a pro bono case of a man who is a self-confessed murderer? That's not what lawyers need to be doing.
A couple of months after the assassination of the governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer, the only Christian in the civilian cabinet was himself murdered, Shahbaz
Bhatti.
Yeah.
Shahbaz Bhatti was murdered, and this whole case, actually, just to put it in context, the so-called religious groups, and I keep saying so-called because I don't think that they are really religious, because what they're all about is political power, and they're using religion to shore up emotions and to get support for their political power, and to disrupt democratic politics, because they know they'll never come into power through the ballot, and they never have so far. But you have when religion is used for politics, then when this so-called blasphemy issue, which is so emotive and so charged, is used, and nobody is ever charged or tried for misusing this law or for false accusations, then it really becomes what we've seen. It's very easy to just accuse somebody of blasphemy, and then somebody or the other will get charged up and go and do it for you. And but to tell you, when I was in the 1990s, I was working with the Human Rights Commission as a volunteer. I was helping them out with report writing and fact finding and all of that. And
this is the Human Rights
the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, the HRCP, which is on the web at hrcp-web.org, I think. When we investigated cases, there was a spate of blasphemy accusations in the early 1990s. Soon after that, the 295C, it became mandatory to make death the mandatory punishment in a court case.